The year is 1955. Packard finally ditches the flathead straight 8. Don't get me wrong, those straight 8s were incredible engines. They were just getting a bit long in the tooth at this point for an overhead valve V8 design. It's important to note that Packard wasn't the only company that waited this long to go overhead valve, or V8 for that matter. Pontiac also goes V8 in 1955. The Packard V8 could be had in 3 displacements from one block size: 320, 352, and 374. The Packard V8 story goes back to 1946. Packard saw the way the industry was going, and they knew that they would eventually have to phase out the straight 8 to be competitive. Packard tested and evaluated many different designs and different block materials like aluminum. In 1949, Packard started putting the design to paper. It was going to be a 269 cubic inch displacement, but they decided that engine was too small, and they didn't want to be caught with their pants down around their ankles, so to speak, when the competition started making bigger displacements. The Packard V8 block weighed 210 pounds. The block was casted from alloyed iron. The block for all of the displacements was the same, but the bore size differed. This engine was big, beefy, over-engineered, overbuilt. Packard wouldn't have it any other way. This engine had thick walls. Bore could support up to 5 inches of bore, potentially 500 cubic inch displacement, perhaps more. Crankshaft was heat-treated alloy steel casting, and it weighed about 56 pounds. The crankshaft also used 6 counterweights, so just the block and the crank weighed 265 pounds so far. For those keeping score, 5 main bearings. Pistons were aluminum alloy, and they were the slipper type. Used 2 compression rings and 1 oil ring. Cast steel camshaft, hydraulic lifters, shaft-mounted rocker arm cylinder heads were cast iron, and they weighed about 64 pounds. Packard experimented with different combustion chamber configurations. Packard ended up going with elliptical shaped, which produced high turbulence wedge type chamber. Tests proved that this setup could handle up to 12-to-1 compression. This engine used a full pressurized oil system fed by gear-type oil pump with a floating pickup in the pan, but it used a partial flow oil filter. So just to be clear, this engine family doesn't use a spin-on oil filter or a full flow oil filter. All told, the Packard V8 weighed about 698 pounds. It was 54 pounds lighter than the outgoing inline 8. The V8 was also a ½ inch lower and 8.5 inches shorter than the outgoing straight 8 engine. So, starting with the smallest displacement engine, it's important to note that this engine was only used in 1955, and it could be found in the Clipper Deluxe or the Super Clipper. It was also used in the Nash and Hudsons, and we're going to come back to that. But 320 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8. 5.2 liters. It's good for 225 horsepower, 4,600 RPM, 325 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM, with a bore of 3.8 inches and a stroke of 3.5 inches. Compression was 8.1 to 1. Featured a Carter WCFB 4-barrel carburetor. It was only used for 1955. So why exactly did AMC get the Packard V8? George Mason negotiated a verbal agreement with Packard that the two companies would supply parts for one another if practical to do so. The Packard V8 supplied to AMC had a thicker head gasket, which reduced power output. Packard sent other parts to AMC as well, but were rejected because of cost. There was talks of Packard Studebaker merging with AMC, but that never happened. George Mason died suddenly, and George Robney took over at AMC. With Robney at the helm, he cut ties with Packard and gave orders to build their own V8. Up next, the middle option, 352 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8, 5.8 liters. It could make between 245 to 275 horsepower at 4,600 RPM, 355 to 380 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM, with a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3.5 inches. Compression is anywhere between 8.5 to 9.5 to 1. This engine could be found in 1955 or 1956. In 1955, it was in the Patrician 400 and Caribbean. In 1956, it was found in the Clipper Deluxe, Clipper Super, Nash, and Hudson, the senior series models. This engine was used for 1955 through 1956. The biggest and baddest Packard V8 ever made, 374 cubic inch displacement overhead valve V8, 6.1 liters. It's good for anywhere between 290 to 310 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. 405 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM, with a bore of 4.125 inches and a stroke of 3.5 inches. Compression was 10 to 1. It was only used in 1956 and could be found in the Packard 400, Patrician, and the Caribbean. For reasons I can't explain, after 1956, the Packard V8 was dropped, and it was only used for 2 years, 55 and 56. Sources vary on the total cost of development. Some say that they spent $22 million on developing costs for this engine for 2 years of production, which is crazy. Why they didn't produce this engine longer is beyond me. The Packard V8 was replaced by the Studebaker V8 in 1957. Hindsight is always 2020. Packard picked the wrong partner to merge with. For those that don't know, Packard merged with Studebaker in 1954. It was a Packard takeover of Studebaker, and for reasons I can't explain, Studebaker got to live on. It's an absolute shame. I was putting off doing this engine episode because I knew it would tear me up inside, and that's what it did. Some will say that the engine was very heavy and that's why it was canceled. Anyway, now it's time for Would You Rather, 2 scenarios today. In the first scenario, would you rather have a 1955 Hudson Hornet or 1956 Studebaker Golden Hawk? Interesting trivia, this was the only Studebaker to be powered by a Packard engine. Or 1956 Nash Ambassador. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Moving on to the second scenario, would you rather have a 1955 Packard Caribbean or 1956 Packard Executive or 1956 Packard Caribbean? I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below or check out our Facebook group I call the After Party. It gives you the opportunity to share your rides, stories, experiences, anything car related on there. If you don't have Facebook and would still like to reach me, send me an email. All of it will be linked in the description below. Just know I really do appreciate all of your support. I love all the comments, and I read and answer all comments posted because I try to run this channel as a community, and I'm part of it. And until next time, toodaloo!